The flames of Troy rise against the night sky, not from some accident of war, but because of a single man's rage. A rage so fierce it bends gods to its will and rewrites the fate of nations. This is the story of Achilles, the greatest warrior the world has ever known, and the war that would define him forever. Picture this: 1,000 ships launched for one woman's beauty, kingdoms clashing over pride, and a hero torn between glory and grief. But this isn't just the Trojan War as you've heard it. Over the next 25 tales, we'll peel back the layers of myth to reveal the man behind the legend. How a demigod's wrath nearly doomed an entire army, how love and loss forged his destiny, and why his name still echoes through history. From his mother's desperate attempt to make him immortal, to the fatal arrow that found his one weakness, to the shocking moment he showed mercy to his greatest enemy, this is the unfiltered saga of Achilles. Strap in, because we're not just recounting a war. We're stepping onto the blood-soaked sands of Troy itself, where every decision could mean immortality or oblivion. And by the end, you'll understand why this ancient warrior's story still grips us thousands of years later. The battle begins now. Now let's journey back to where it all began, before the rage, before the war, to the very origins of Achilles himself. His story starts not on the battlefield, but with a love affair between a goddess and a mortal. Thetis, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, caught the eye of Peleus, a king known more for his perseverance than his power. Their union was anything but ordinary. It was orchestrated by the gods themselves. Zeus, the king of the gods, had once desired Thetis, but a prophecy warned that her son would surpass his father. Not keen on being outshone, Zeus swiftly arranged her marriage to a mortal, ensuring any child of theirs, though mighty, would never threaten the gods. From the moment Achilles was born, fate had its grip on him. Thetis, knowing her son was destined for greatness and an early death, couldn't bear the thought of losing him. So she took desperate measures. In the dead of night, she carried the infant Achilles to the river Styx, the dark boundary between the living and the dead. Dunking him into its cursed waters, she held him by the heel, believing its magic would make him invulnerable, and it worked almost. Every part of him touched by the Styx became impervious to harm, except that one spot where her fingers gripped him. A small oversight with devastating consequences, but Thetis wasn't done. Determined to shield Achilles from his fate, she disguised him as a girl and hid him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. If he never held a sword, she reasoned, he could never die by one. Yet prophecies have a way of unfolding, no matter how hard we try to outrun them. The threads of destiny were already weaving Achilles into the coming war, a conflict that would test not just his invulnerability, but his very soul. And so, the stage was set, a hero born of divine blood, marked by prophecy, and shaped by a mother's love and fear. But no amount of magic or deception could change one unshakable truth. Achilles was destined for glory and tragedy in equal measure. But destiny had more in store for young Achilles than just hiding among princesses. When the time came for him to step into his true role, his mother's plans unraveled in the most unexpected way. Under the watchful eye of the wise centaur Chiron, Achilles' real education began. Far from the halls of Skyros, in the wild slopes of Mount Pelion, Chiron, the legendary mentor of heroes, taught the boy more than just combat. Here, Achilles learned to track prey through dense forests, to heal wounds with herbs, and to play the lyre with such skill that even the trees seemed to listen. Chiron didn't just train warriors, he shaped minds. Philosophy, music, and the art of war flowed together in his lessons, forging Achilles into more than a fighter. He became a thinker, a leader in the making. Yet no training could prepare him for the bond that would define his life. Enter Patroclus, an exiled prince sent to live with Peleus' household. At first glance, they were opposites: Achilles, golden and destined for glory; Patroclus, quiet and thoughtful. But in each other they found something rare. Patroclus tempered Achilles' fiery pride, while Achilles drew out his friend's hidden courage. Together they trained, competed, and grew inseparable. Some say their friendship blurred into love, others insist it was brotherhood. Either way, their fates became threads in the same tapestry. By his teenage years, Achilles' reputation spread like wildfire across Greece. Stories told of him outrunning deer, hurling spears farther than seasoned soldiers, and wrestling bulls barehanded. But his greatest strength wasn't just his sticks-blessed skin or his godlike reflexes. It was the relentless drive that burned within him. While other boys dreamed of battle, Achilles seemed to move with the certainty of someone who knew his name would echo through the ages. Little did he realize how soon that destiny would call. For even as he honed his skills on Pelion slopes far to the east, a Trojan prince was making choices that would drag all of Greece into war, and Achilles straight into the heart of it. But destiny has a way of weaving its own designs, and no amount of mortal planning could keep Achilles from the war that would define his legend. The threads of his fate were already tied to Troy long before the first ship set sail, thanks to an oath sworn by kings, the oath of Tyndaris. When Helen, the most beautiful woman in Greece, was courted by dozens of suitors, her father Tyndaris faced a dilemma. How could he choose a husband without sparking jealousy and war among the rejected kings? The solution came from the cunning Odysseus, who proposed a binding pact. Every suitor would swear to defend Helen's chosen husband against any threat to their marriage. In one stroke, the oath turned rival princes into allies, ensuring that if Helen were ever taken, all of Greece would rise to bring her back. Years later, when Paris of Troy stole Helen from Menelaus, that oath became the fuse for war. Agamemnon, Menelaus' brother, called upon every sworn king to honor their pledge, including Achilles' father, Peleus. But Thetis, desperate to spare her son from the prophecy of his death, had hidden Achilles in disguise among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. Dressed as a girl and called by the name Pyrrha, he might have stayed there forever if not for Odysseus' sharp eye. The Greeks, knowing they needed Achilles to win, sent Odysseus to uncover him. Disguised as a merchant, Odysseus laid out gifts before Lycomedes' daughters, fine fabrics, jewelry, and among them, a gleaming sword and shield. When a sudden war horn sounded, the real test began. While the girls screamed and fled, one maiden instinctively grabbed the weapons. In that moment, Achilles' warrior spirit betrayed him. Odysseus smiled, recognizing the young hero instantly. The game was up. With his identity revealed, Achilles faced a choice: honor his father's oath and join the war, or defy destiny itself. But for a man raised on glory, there was only one path. He took up his armor, gathered his Myrmidon warriors, and set sail for Troy, unaware that this decision would etch his name into eternity. And so the stage was set for the greatest clash of the age. But as Achilles sailed toward his destiny, another figure watched from the shadows: Agamemnon, the Greek high king, whose pride would soon ignite the fury of the gods themselves. Now the winds of war carried Achilles to Aulis, where the might of Greece gathered 1,000 ships waiting to cross the Aegean. With him came the Myrmidons, fierce warriors forged in the fires of his homeland, their loyalty as unshakable as their discipline. From the moment they arrived, whispers spread through the camp. Here was no ordinary soldier, but a demigod whose very presence seemed to bend the air around him. Yet even legends must navigate mortal politics. Agamemnon, high king of the Greeks, eyed Achilles with a mix of admiration and unease. Here was a warrior who might outshine him, a thought that chafed against his pride. Their first clash came not on the battlefield, but over honor and spoils. When Achilles demanded proper recognition for his Myrmidons, Agamemnon bristled, setting the stage for a rivalry that would shake the heavens. But war waits for no man's pride. When the Trojans met the Greeks in those early battles, Achilles proved why the prophecies feared him. His speed was unmatched, a blur of bronze and fury, cutting through enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. Cities fell before him, their names now footnotes to his legend. Tenedos, Lyrnessus, even the mighty Thebes, each conquest added to his myth, each victory tightening fate's grip. And then came the day the Trojans learned true terror. From their walls they watched as Achilles single-handedly turned the tide of battle, his myrmidons carving a crimson path behind him. Warriors who had faced him spoke in hushed tones afterward of how he fought not like a man but like a force of nature, yet for all his triumphs the greatest test still lay ahead. Because while Achilles waged war on the battlefield, another conflict simmered, one that would soon erupt with consequences neither he nor Agamemnon could foresee. The seeds of wrath had been sown, and soon they would bear bitter fruit. But even the greatest warriors are bound by pride, and Achilles was no exception. The spark that ignited his fury came not from the battlefield, but from the tents of the Greek camp. After one decisive victory, the spoils were divided: gold, weapons, and captives distributed among the leaders. Among them was Briseis, a priest's daughter taken as a war prize, awarded to Achilles for his unmatched valor. Then came Agamemnon's fateful decree, forced to return his own captive after a plague struck the Greek camp, a punishment from Apollo. The High King demanded compensation. His choice, Briseis, to strip Achilles of his rightful prize was more than an insult. It was a public humiliation, a blow to his honor that cut deeper than any sword. In that moment, the hero's rage burned brighter than the fires of Troy. Achilles refused to fight. Withdrawing to his tent, he let his armor gather dust while the Greeks faltered without him. But his anger wasn't silent. He called upon his mother, Thetis, the sea nymph, with a plea that would ripple through Olympus itself. "Let Zeus grant the Trojans victory," he demanded, "until Agamemnon learns the cost of his arrogance." Thetis, heartbroken but bound by a mother's love, carried his words to the king of the gods, and so the tide turned. With Achilles absent, the Trojans gained ground, their spears finding gaps in Greek lines that had once seemed unbreakable. Agamemnon soon realized his mistake, but pride is a slow poison. Offers of gold and apologies piled up outside Achilles' tent, yet the hero remained unmoved. For now, the war would be fought without him, and the Greeks would pay the price. But this was only the beginning, because while Achilles nursed his wrath in solitude, another figure stepped into the chaos: Patroclus, his closest companion, who would soon make a choice that changed everything. As the dust settled over the Greek camp, the absence of their greatest warrior sent shockwaves through the battlefield. Without Achilles, the Trojans found new courage, led by their own champion, Hector. The Prince of Troy seized the moment, cutting through Greek ranks like a storm through wheat fields. Where Achilles had once been an unbreakable wall, now there were only gaps, weak points Hector exploited with ruthless precision. Day after day, the Greeks were pushed back toward their ships, their defenses crumbling under Hector's relentless assault. Even the mightiest warriors like Diomedes and Ajax struggled to hold the line. The Trojans, sensing victory, pressed harder, their spears thirsty for Greek blood. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Greek camp, desperation took root. Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend, could no longer bear the sight of his comrades falling. The cries of the wounded, the fires creeping closer to the ships, it was too much. He stormed into Achilles' tent, his voice trembling with urgency. "If you won't fight, let me," he pleaded. "Lend me your armor. Let the Trojans think for even a moment that you've returned." "It might buy us time." Achilles hesitated, his pride still a smoldering ember. But in the end, he relented, warning Patroclus only to drive the Trojans back, not to pursue them to the walls. With Achilles' divine armor strapped to his body, Patroclus charged into battle, a flicker of hope for the Greeks. At first, the ruse worked. The Trojans faltered, their confidence shaken by the sight of that familiar, terrifying figure. Patroclus fought with a fury that mirrored his friends, driving the enemy back, buying precious ground. But then came the fatal mistake. Drunk on the thrill of battle, he ignored Achilles' warning, pushing forward toward Troy's towering gates. And there, waiting like a shadow, stood Hector. The two clashed, spear against shield, but Patroclus was no Achilles. The armor couldn't save him. With a single, brutal strike, Hector brought him down, stripping the divine gear from his fallen foe as a trophy. The news reached Achilles like a dagger to the heart. His wrath, once directed at Agamemnon, now twisted into something far darker, a grief so consuming it would change the course of the war. But that is a tale for another moment. For now, the battlefield belonged to Hector, and the Greeks faced their darkest hour. But the tide of battle is a fickle thing, and no hero's luck lasts forever. Patroclus, clad in Achilles' gleaming armor, became a beacon of hope for the Greeks, a fleeting illusion of their champion's return. At first, his charge was unstoppable. Trojans scattered before him, their ranks breaking like waves against a cliff. He cut down warriors with the same terrifying efficiency as Achilles, his spear a blur of vengeance. The Greeks, reinvigorated, rallied behind him, pushing Hector's forces back toward the city walls. For a moment, it seemed the war might turn on this single act of defiance. Yet glory has a way of clouding judgment. Patroclus, drunk on the rush of battle, forgot Achilles' warning. Instead of holding the line, he chased the retreating Trojans all the way to the towering gates of Troy, a fatal overreach. There, bathed in the crimson light of sunset, Hector stood waiting. The Prince of Troy had seen through the ruse. He knew this wasn't Achilles. The two clashed, shield against shield, but Patroclus, for all his courage, was no match for Troy's greatest warrior. Hector's spear found its mark, piercing through the borrowed armor as if it were parchment. Patroclus fell, his last breath a whisper of his friend's name. Hector stripped the divine armor from the corpse, a trophy to demoralize the Greeks further. But the true cost of this victory would be measured not in blood, but in the fury it unleashed. When the news reached Achilles, it shattered him. The man who had once refused to fight for pride now had a reason far more terrible, grief so consuming it bordered on madness. The Greeks would soon learn that a wounded Achilles was far more dangerous than an absent one. And as Hector stood triumphant over Patroclus' body, he had no idea he'd just sealed his own fate. The storm was coming, and its name was Achilles. Now the story takes a darker turn as we witness the raw, unfiltered grief of a warrior pushed beyond his limits. When the news of Patroclus' death reached Achilles, his wail was said to shake the very beaches of Troy. This wasn't just mourning, it was the sound of a soul tearing in two. He collapsed onto the black sand, clawing at his face, his golden hair now streaked with ash as he poured dirt over himself in a ritual of despair. The Greeks watched in stunned silence. This wasn't the proud, defiant Achilles they knew. This was something far more terrifying, a man with nothing left to lose. His mother Thetis heard his cries from the depths of the sea and came rushing to his side. When she saw her son broken on the shore, even the immortal nymph understood the depth of his pain. In that moment, she made a decision that would change the course of the war. Leaving Achilles to his grief, Thetis traveled to Mount Olympus itself, to the forge of Hephaestus. The god of fire, moved by her tears, agreed to craft armor unlike anything ever seen, a celestial suit worthy of a demigod's vengeance. Meanwhile, Achilles' sorrow hardened into something colder, sharper. He swore an oath that would haunt the Trojans he wouldn't bury Patroclus until Hector's corpse lay at his feet. The Greeks shuddered at the transformation. Where once stood a man who refused to fight over pride, now stood a force of nature with only one purpose: retribution written in blood. And as Hephaestus' hammer struck the divine metal, shaping a shield depicting the entire world, both gods and men held their breath. The stage was set for the most devastating return in Greek mythology. As the sun rose over Troy, the battlefield fell silent, but not for long. The earth trembled as Achilles emerged, clad in Hephaestus' gleaming armor, his presence alone sending shockwaves through the Trojan ranks. This wasn't just a warrior returning to battle. This was vengeance made flesh. With a single roar, Achilles charged, his spear cutting through the enemy like a storm through wheat. The Trojans, who had grown bold in his absence, now scrambled in terror. Even Hector, their greatest champion, hesitated at the sight. Achilles moved with inhuman speed, his every strike precise, brutal, and fueled by grief. The Scamander River ran red as he carved a path toward Troy's gates, his fury so immense that legend claims he fought like a god walking among mortals. The Greeks, once demoralized, now rallied behind him, their cheers mixing with the screams of the Trojans. But Achilles wasn't fighting for glory or for them. His eyes were fixed on one man, Hector, who had taken everything from him. The Trojans retreated behind their walls, but the message was clear: no fortress could protect them from what was coming. And as the dust settled, Achilles stood alone on the bloodied field, his chest heaving, his gaze locked on Troy's towering gates. The war had changed in a single day. The invincible hero was back, and this time he wouldn't stop until his oath was fulfilled. But the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Inside Troy's walls, Hector knew there was no escape. The city's fate rested on his shoulders, yet even the bravest of warriors hesitated when facing the storm of Achilles' wrath. As the gates creaked open, Hector stepped onto the battlefield, not with the confidence of a champion, but with the grim resolve of a man who understood his destiny. The two warriors circled each other, the air thick with tension. Achilles' eyes burned with a cold fire, every muscle coiled for the strike. Hector, though outmatched in speed and divine fury, stood firm, his spear steady. He knew the stories, knew that no mortal had ever bested Achilles in single combat. Yet here he was, the last shield between Troy and annihilation. The clash was inevitable. Achilles lunged first, his spear a blur, but Hector twisted away, countering with a strike that glanced off the god-forged armor. The duel became a dance of death, Achilles relentless, Hector desperate. Every near miss drew gasps from the armies watching, their fates hanging on each movement. Then came the fatal mistake. Hector turned just for a heartbeat, and in that instant Achilles struck. The spear found its mark, piercing Hector's throat. As the Trojan prince crumpled, the battlefield fell silent. Even the Greeks, victorious, held their breath. This wasn't just a kill, it was the end of an era. But Achilles' vengeance wasn't satisfied. With a snarl, he tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust, defying every law of honor. The Trojans wailed from the walls, their hero reduced to a broken spectacle. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, one truth echoed across the plain: the war had reached its darkest hour. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the gods watched, and not all were pleased, for every act of vengeance sows the seeds of its own undoing. But the story takes an even darker turn in the days that followed. Achilles' rage had not cooled with Hector's death. If anything, it burned hotter. Each morning, as the sun rose over Troy, the Greeks would watch in stunned silence as Achilles tied Hector's lifeless body to his chariot and dragged it 3 times around Patroclus' burial mound. The once noble prince of Troy was now reduced to a gruesome spectacle, his flesh torn by the rough earth. The Trojans wept from their walls, powerless to stop this sacrilege against their fallen hero. Yet here's where the gods stepped in, because even in their cruelty they had limits. Apollo, Hector's divine protector, could not let this dishonor continue. Though he couldn't interfere directly, he shielded Hector's body from decay and mutilation. Each night, as Achilles left the corpse exposed to the elements, Apollo anointed it with ambrosia, preserving it untouched by rot or scavengers. The gods whispered among themselves. Even Zeus, who had allowed Achilles his vengeance, grew uneasy at this defiance of sacred rites. For 12 long days, this macabre ritual repeated. The Greeks murmured that Achilles had gone too far, while the Trojans' grief curdled into something colder, a vow that no mercy would be shown when their turn for vengeance came. And then, on the 12th night, a figure slipped unseen into the Greek camp. It was Hermes, guiding an old man wrapped in a humble cloak, none other than King Priam himself, risking everything to reclaim his son's body. The stage was set for one of the most unexpected moments in the entire war. After all the bloodshed, after all the rage, even Achilles would find himself face to face with something he thought he'd buried long ago, his own humanity. Now, in the quiet of the Greek camp under a moonlit sky, an extraordinary moment unfolds, one that would redefine the war's brutality. King Priam, the once proud ruler of Troy, now moved like a shadow through enemy lines, guided by Hermes' divine hand. His cloak was humble, his face lined with grief, but his purpose burned bright. He knelt before Achilles' tent, not as a king, but as a father. The man who had lost so much, his sons, his city's hope, now gambled his own life for the right to bury his eldest. The air inside the tent was thick with tension. Achilles, still seething from weeks of rage, looked up to see his greatest enemy at his feet. Yet what happened next stunned even the gods. Priam didn't plead from a place of power. He spoke of Achilles' own father, Peleus, waiting somewhere far away, praying his son would return alive. He spoke of the universal agony of parents who outlived their children. And then, with tears mixing with the dust on the floor, he kissed the hands that had killed his son. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles' fury cracked. He thought of his father, of the love he'd once known, of the humanity war had tried to strip from him. In that fragile silence, he lifted Priam up and agreed to return Hector's body. Not for gold or glory, but because grief, he realized, was a language even enemies could share. Together, they shared a meal, an unthinkable act between foes, and for one night the war paused. But dawn would come, and with it the battlefield's cruel logic. As Priam slipped back to Troy with his son's body, Achilles knew this mercy wouldn't last. The gods had granted them a moment's peace, but the fates were already spinning darker threads. The war's endgame was near, and even kindness couldn't stop what was coming. Yet even in grief, Achilles found a way to honor his fallen friend, not with tears alone, but with action. As the pyre's embers cooled, he called the Greeks to compete in funeral games for Patroclus, a tradition reserved for heroes. The contests would be fierce chariot races, boxing, archery, but the stakes were deeper than glory. Here, in the dust and sweat of competition, Achilles revealed a side of himself the war had buried, a leader who could inspire as easily as he could destroy. The chariot race erupted first, horses straining as nobles whipped their teams toward victory. But when Antilochus, young and daring, cut off Menelaus by sheer audacity, the dispute that followed threatened to unravel the games. Menelaus, pride wounded, demanded his honor be restored. Achilles, though no stranger to rage, did something unexpected. He mediated. With a king's authority, he awarded prizes to both, soothing tempers without bloodshed. It was a glimpse of the diplomat he might have been, had war not honed him into a blade. Next came the boxing, where fighters' knuckles split under the force of their blows. Epeios, a brute of a man, boasted he'd crush any challenger, and he did, until Achilles himself placed the victor's laurels on his head. Then archery, where Myrion's arrow pierced a dove mid-flight, drawing cheers. Each event was a mirror held up to the warriors, their skill, their pride, their hunger to be remembered. But the most telling moment came last. Achilles offered a prize for the footrace, a silver mixing bowl, ornate and priceless. When young Ajax and Odysseus sprinted neck and neck, the crowd roared. Ajax, stronger but slower, lost by a breath. His face darkened with humiliation, but before he could protest, Achilles added a second prize, praising both men's worth. It was a small act, but in it lay a truth. The games weren't just for Patroclus. They were Achilles' attempt to mend what the war had broken, the bonds between men. As the sun dipped low, the Greeks feasted, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence of Patroclus' tomb. Yet Achilles, watching from the shadows, knew these moments of light were fleeting. The games had been a respite, but Troy's walls still loomed, and deep in his heart the whisper of his own fate grew louder. Yet even as the funeral games faded into memory, the war ground on, and Troy's desperation summoned an unexpected ally. From the distant lands of the Amazons came Penthesilea, a queen as fierce as she was doomed. Clad in armor forged by the gods themselves, she led her warrior women into battle, not for gold or glory, but to cleanse her soul of a past shame. Some say she'd accidentally killed her sister in the hunt, and this was her penance. Others whisper she sought death in combat, a warrior's end. Whatever her reasons, her arrival sent a ripple through the Greek camp. Here was no ordinary foe, but a legend made flesh. Achilles, still wrapped in grief's shadow, barely glanced at the reports of this new threat until he saw her on the battlefield. Penthesilea fought like a storm, her axe cutting through Greek ranks with terrifying grace. Where others saw only an enemy, Achilles saw something rarer, an equal. Their clash was inevitable, a dance of spears and fury under Troy's blood-red dawn. When his final strike found her heart, the moment should have ended there. But as Penthesilea fell, her helmet tumbled away and Achilles froze. Her face in death was achingly young. A strange hollowness opened in his chest, something beyond victory or vengeance. Some poets claim he loved her then, in that fractured second between life and loss. Others say it was merely the shock of recognizing himself in her, another doomed warrior, another story cut short. Whatever the truth, his men watched in silence as he cradled her body, tender as a bridegroom. The Greeks, ever cruel, mocked his sudden gentleness. One soldier, their sights, jeered loudest until Achilles' fist silenced him forever. Penthesilea's brief flame had burned out, but her legacy lingered. In slaying her, Achilles had glimpsed the cost of his own legend. The war would call him back soon enough to face Hector's brother and fresh horrors. Yet for a fleeting moment, the greatest of Greeks had remembered what it was to be human. Yet even as the dust settled over Penthesilea's fallen form, fate was already weaving another thread into Troy's tapestry of tragedy. From the sun-scorched lands of Ethiopia came Memnon, a king whose very blood shimmered with divinity, son of the dawn goddess Eos, clad in armor that gleamed like the morning sky. His arrival was no mere reinforcement for Troy. It was an omen. Memnon fought with the weight of prophecy on his shoulders, his spear carving through Greek ranks as effortlessly as sunlight through mist. His presence reignited hope in Troy's weary defenders, for here was a warrior who seemed untouchable, blessed by the gods themselves. But the Greeks had their own champion, still raw from the haunting encounter with Penthesilea. When Achilles locked eyes with Memnon across the battlefield, both knew this clash would echo beyond mortal lifetimes. Their duel was less a fight than a force of nature, two storms colliding. Spears shattered against shields forged by divine hands, dust swirling around them like a shroud. Yet for all Memnon's brilliance, Achilles fought with the grief of Patroclus still burning in his veins. The moment his blade found its mark, history repeated itself in cruel symmetry. Just as Patroclus had fallen to Hector, now Memnon crumpled, his divine blood staining the earth. But where mortal men might have mourned, the gods intervened. Memnon's mother, Eos, wept so fiercely that her tears became morning dew, and Zeus, moved by her sorrow, granted her son a fleeting immortality. Flames consumed Memnon's body, lifting his spirit skyward as a murmuration of birds, their wings beating in eternal homage. This divine mercy struck a chord even in Achilles, who watched the spectacle with uncharacteristic stillness. Memnon's death was more than another tally in the war's ledger. It was a mirror held up to Achilles' own fate, a reminder that even the mightiest are but fleeting sparks in the gods' grand design. And as the Trojan ranks faltered without their radiant champion, whispers spread through the Greek camp. The walls of Troy still stood, but the hour of reckoning drew nearer, and with it the revelation of Achilles' own mortal weakness. Yet even as the gods honored Memnon's passing, the threads of destiny tightened around Achilles himself. The legend we've all heard whispers of is about to unfold, the moment when the mightiest of warriors meets his end through the one spot untouched by invincibility. The stories diverge sharply when it comes to Achilles' final moments. Some say Paris, the Trojan prince who started this war by stealing Helen. loosed the fatal arrow with cowardly precision, guided by Apollo himself. The god of archery, still seething over past slights, allegedly directed the shot straight to that infamous heel, the only place where Thetis' protective grip had failed during his infancy in the river Styx. But other versions paint a darker betrayal. They claim Achilles had confided his weakness to a lover, perhaps even Polyxena, a Trojan princess, and that Paris learned the secret through deception. Imagine the scene: Achilles, believing himself untouchable even as he storms Troy's gates, never noticing the archer taking aim at his one vulnerable point. The arrow strikes, and the hero who once seemed invincible collapses like a toppled pillar. Here's where the myths grow even more intriguing. Some accounts insist the wound wasn't immediately fatal, that Achilles managed to slaughter dozens more Trojans before the venom on Paris' arrow, some say dipped in Hydra's blood, finally stilled his heart. Others describe Apollo not just guiding the arrow, but disguising himself as Paris to ensure the shot found its mark. What all versions agree on is the cruel irony. The warrior who survived countless battles, who faced Hector and Memnon and lived, fell not in glorious combat but to a single well-placed strike. His death reshaped the war's final days, leaving the Greeks without their living weapon, yet fueling their rage to conquer Troy in his name. And with that, we approach the war's grim finale, but not before witnessing how Achilles' legacy continued to shape events from beyond the grave. His armor would spark a deadly rivalry, his son would take up his vengeful mantle, and his ghost would whisper the strategy that finally toppled Troy's walls. The heel was his undoing, but his shadow loomed larger than ever. Even in death, Achilles' influence over the Trojan War refused to fade. As the Greeks struggled to breach Troy's mighty walls, a spectral figure appeared to a young warrior, Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus. The ghost of the fallen hero, still clad in battle-worn armor, delivered a prophecy that would change the course of history. He revealed that brute force alone would never conquer Troy. Instead, victory would come through cunning, a hollow wooden horse filled with Greek soldiers, left as a false offering to the Trojans. Imagine Neoptolemus' shock, hearing his father's voice from beyond the grave, whispering the strategy that would doom the city Achilles himself had failed to take. Some versions claim the ghost appeared during a sacrificial ceremony at Achilles' tomb, while others say it came in a dream. But all agree on one chilling detail: Achilles knew exactly how this war would end. His words sent Neoptolemus racing to the Greek commanders with the plan, setting in motion the legendary deception. Here's what makes this moment so fascinating. After 10 years of bloodshed, it took a dead man's insight to break the stalemate. The very warrior who embodied direct combat in life became the architect of history's most famous trick in death. And his son, barely more than a boy, would play a pivotal role in carrying out his father's final wish, the complete destruction of Troy. As the Greeks began constructing their massive wooden offering, one wonders, did Achilles foresee the horrors to come? The slaughter of Priam at his own altars, the enslavement of Trojan women, the fires that would consume the city, or was his ghost solely focused on Greek victory, no matter the cost? This eerie encounter proves that even without his legendary strength, Achilles remained the war's driving force. His ghost didn't just predict the future, it shaped it, ensuring his name would be forever tied to Troy's fall. And as we'll see next, the aftermath of his prophecy would spark yet another tragedy among the Greeks themselves. But the echoes of Achilles' prophecy were soon drowned out by a bitter feud among the Greeks themselves. With Troy's fall now inevitable, a new conflict erupted, one that would pit brother against brother in a battle for the ultimate symbol of glory, the prize. Achilles' divine armor, forged by Hephaestus himself. Ajax the Great, a warrior second only to Achilles in strength, believed the armor was rightfully his. Had he not stood as the Greeks' bulwark when Achilles withdrew from battle? Had he not defended the ships single-handedly against Hector's onslaught? To Ajax, the armor was a tribute to his unmatched valor, but Odysseus, the master strategist, saw things differently. He argued that without his cunning, the very quality Achilles' ghost had endorsed the Greeks would never have reached this moment. The armor, he claimed, belonged to the mind that outsmarted Troy, not just the muscle that held the line. The Greek commanders were torn. When they ultimately awarded the armor to Odysseus, Ajax's rage consumed him. In a fit of madness sent by the goddess Athena, he mistook a flock of sheep for his rivals and slaughtered them, believing he was taking vengeance. When the haze lifted and he realized his disgrace, the shame was unbearable. The mighty Ajax, who had faced Hector without flinching, could not face his own humiliation. He fell upon his sword, ending his life in the same way he had lived, with terrifying, uncompromising force. This tragedy reveals a haunting truth about the Trojan War's aftermath. Even in victory, the Greeks were fractured by pride and grief. The armor meant to honor Achilles' legacy instead became a catalyst for destruction among his own comrades. And as we'll soon see, the ripple effects of this dispute would stretch far beyond that bloody shore, shaping the fates of those who survived. As the dust settled over the fallen Ajax, a new figure stepped onto the blood-soaked sands of Troy, one whose arrival carried the weight of destiny. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, had come to claim his father's legacy. Though young, he bore the same fire in his eyes, the same unyielding fury that had made Achilles a legend. The Greeks, desperate for victory, saw in him a spark of hope. Here was the heir to their greatest warrior, raised in isolation on the island of Skyros, now thrust into the heart of a war his father had shaped. Neoptolemus did not disappoint. From his first moments on the battlefield, he fought with a ferocity that mirrored Achilles at his most ruthless. But where his father had been a storm of emotion, pride, grief, vengeance, Neoptolemus was something colder, more calculating. He had grown up knowing only the shadow of a father he never met, and now he sought to carve his own name into history. The Trojans, already reeling from years of siege, faced a new nightmare as this untested but deadly force joined the fray. Then came the night that would forever stain his legacy. As the Greeks finally breached Troy's walls, chaos erupted. Priam, the aged king, sought refuge at the altar of Zeus, clinging to the faint hope that even in the madness of war, the gods would protect a supplicant. But Neoptolemus showed no such mercy. In a moment that echoed his father's most brutal acts, he dragged the trembling king from the altar and slaughtered him without hesitation. It was a chilling act, one that revealed the dark inheritance of Achilles' rage, unfiltered by the humanity that had occasionally tempered his father's wrath. This was more than just another death in a war filled with them. Priam's murder at a place of sanctuary shattered the last remnants of honor in the conflict. Neoptolemus, though victorious, had crossed a line that even Achilles had not. And as the flames of Troy climbed higher, the son's actions would cast a long shadow over his father's complicated legacy. But the story doesn't end here. The war's final act still loomed, and with it the question of what would become of those who survived this carnage. But even as the ashes of Troy settled, the legend of Achilles was far from over. His story would stretch beyond the mortal world into the shadowy realm of the dead. When Odysseus, years later, ventured into the underworld during his long journey home, he came face to face with the ghost of the greatest Greek warrior. What he found was not the triumphant hero of legend, but a restless spirit filled with haunting regret. Achilles' shade told Odysseus he would rather be a slave on earth than a king among the dead. A shocking admission from a man who had once valued glory above all else. This moment reveals the tragic irony of his life. The warrior who chased immortality through fame now wandered the asphodel meadows, forever separated from the sunlight and battles he loved. Even in death, his pride lingered. When Odysseus praised his unmatched legacy, Achilles' ghost simply asked after his son, Neoptolemus, showing a flicker of the humanity buried beneath his myth. Yet later traditions offered a different fate. Some poets claimed Achilles was granted a blessed afterlife in the Elysian fields, reserved for the most heroic souls. There he was said to live in eternal splendor, reunited with Patroclus. This version softens his story, suggesting even the gods couldn't deny him peace forever. But which ending feels true, the tormented ghost or the honored hero, perhaps both? Achilles was always a paradox, both the pinnacle of mortal achievement and a warning of its cost. His uncertain afterlife mirrors the contradictions of his life, a demigod who chose a short, glorious life over a long, quiet one, only to question that choice in death. As we move forward, we'll see how his legacy continued to evolve, not just in myth, but in the lives of those who remembered him. But while Achilles' ghost wandered the underworld, another figure from his life carried forward his legacy in the living world. Let's turn now to Briseis, the woman whose fate was so deeply entwined with Achilles' rage and grief. Captured as a war prize after the sack of Lyrnessus, she became far more than just a trophy. She was a silent witness to the greatest drama of the Trojan War. Briseis' story begins in tragedy. Torn from her homeland and family, she was given to Achilles as a symbol of his prowess, only to be seized by Agamemnon, sparking the wrath that would define the war. Yet Homer's Iliad offers glimpses of her humanity. When Patroclus fell, it was Briseis who led the mourning women, weeping not just for the kind-hearted warrior who'd treated her with respect, but perhaps for the unraveling of the fragile peace she'd known in Achilles' tent. Her lament for Patroclus, calling him always gentle, hints at the unspoken bonds formed in the shadows of war. Later traditions suggest an even deeper connection. Some ancient sources claim Briseis carried Achilles' child, a boy named Pyrrhus, who would later be known as Neoptolemus. If true, this adds a haunting layer to her story, a mother raising the son of the man who destroyed her world, a living bridge between Trojan suffering and Greek glory. Other versions say she was given to Achilles' comrade Alcimus after the war, her fate fading into obscurity. What makes Briseis remarkable is how she embodies war's hidden casualties. Unlike Helen, whose face launched 1,000 ships, Briseis had no choice in her role. Her value was measured in the anger she provoked between men, yet her grief and resilience echo beyond the epic's margins. Whether she bore Achilles' heir or vanished into history, her untold story reminds us that behind every legendary hero are the silenced voices that shaped his journey. And as we'll soon see, Achilles' legacy didn't end with Briseis or even his ghost. It lived on in the worship of those who revered him as something closer to a god than a man. But while Briseis' story fades into the shadows of history, Achilles' legend only grew brighter in the centuries after his death. Across the ancient world, warriors and kings sought to connect themselves with his divine power, transforming the fallen hero into something far greater than a mortal man. The shores of the Black Sea became an unexpected epicenter of his worship. On a small island called Luke, meaning White Island, sailors reported seeing Achilles' ghost leading spectral armies across the beaches. This became sacred ground where no birds dared to fly, and where offerings of wine and weapons were left by those seeking the hero's favor. Local tribes even claimed Achilles married the Amazon queen Penthesilea in the afterlife, blending their warrior spirits into a single cult. No admirer was more famous than Alexander the Great, who stopped at Troy during his conquest of Persia specifically to honor his childhood idol. Ancient historians describe how Alexander anointed Achilles' tomb with oil, ran naked around it in imitation of Patroclus' funeral games, then took what he believed was Achilles' shield into battle. This wasn't just tribute, it was a calculated act to position himself as Achilles reborn, another half-divine conqueror destined to reshape the world. Even Rome, though descended from Trojan refugees, couldn't resist Achilles' allure. Emperors like Caracalla staged elaborate reenactments of his life, while ordinary citizens wore amulets bearing his name for protection. The paradox is striking. The man who slaughtered Trojans became a guardian figure for their descendants, his legend transcending the very divisions he died to enforce. What began as Homer's tragic warrior had become, over centuries, a symbol of everything from military excellence to queer love, from divine wrath to artistic inspiration. And as we'll discover next, even the intricate scenes on his legendary shield carried meanings far beyond their metal surface. Now let's turn our attention to something truly extraordinary, the shield of Achilles. Forged by the god Hephaestus himself, this masterpiece wasn't just a piece of armor. It was a miniature universe, a breathtaking work of divine artistry that told the story of human life in all its beauty and brutality. The shield's surface was divided into concentric circles, each one depicting a different scene. At its center lay the earth, sky, and sea, with the sun, moon, and constellations shining above. This wasn't just decoration, it was a reminder that Achilles, for all his rage and power, was still part of a much larger cosmos. The next ring showed two cities, one at peace and one at war. In the peaceful city, marriages were celebrated, disputes were settled in the marketplace, and farmers tended their fields. But in the other, armies clashed at the gates, blood stained the streets, and ambushes unfolded in the shadows. These twin images captured the duality of Achilles' own existence, the life he might have lived and the path he ultimately chose. Further out, the shield displayed scenes of agriculture, fields being plowed, crops harvested, and vineyards heavy with grapes. Then came the pastoral idyll, herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and even a lion stalking its prey. Hephaestus didn't just show the world as it was, he showed it as it could be, full of abundance and danger, order and chaos. And finally, along the outermost rim, the god placed the great river Oceanus, encircling everything like an unbreakable boundary. But here's the irony: Achilles carried this shield into battle, a man who both defended and destroyed the very world depicted on it. The peaceful city could have been Troy before the war. The warriors at the gates might have been Greeks and Trojans locked in their endless struggle. Even the farmers and shepherds mirrored the ordinary lives Achilles and his enemies had left behind. Homer's description of the shield does more than showcase divine craftsmanship. It forces us to ask, what was Achilles fighting for? Glory, vengeance, or something deeper, something as vast and complex as the scenes hammered into that shimmering metal? And as we ponder that question, another mystery awaits: how modern artists and writers have reimagined Achilles' story, giving it new life for audiences today. Now let's step into the modern era, where Achilles' ancient story finds fresh meaning through contemporary retellings. The 21st century has breathed new life into this legendary warrior, reshaping his myth for audiences who see the world through a different lens. At the forefront stands Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, a novel that peels back the layers of Homer's epic to reveal the emotional core of Achilles' bond with Patroclus. No longer just a loyal companion, Patroclus becomes the heart of the story, a gentle soul whose love and loss redefine Achilles' rage and grief. Miller's portrayal flips the traditional narrative, framing the Trojan War not as a quest for glory, but as a tragedy of human connection torn apart by pride and fate. Through her lyrical prose, Achilles emerges as more than a killing machine. He's a young man torn between divine destiny and mortal desires. The novel's intimate focus on their relationship challenges older interpretations, inviting readers to question whether Achilles' wrath was fueled not just by wounded pride but by unbearable heartbreak. But Miller isn't alone in reimagining the myth. Other modern works, from David Malouf's Ransom to graphic novels like Achilles, Legend of the Greatest Warrior, explore his psyche with newfound depth. Malouf's version zeroes in on the quiet, transformative moment between Achilles and Priam, a scene often overshadowed by battles, to highlight the hero's capacity for mercy. Meanwhile, visual adaptations amplify his duality, contrasting the golden boy of prophecy with the blood-stained avenger. What unites these retellings is their insistence on Achilles' humanity. Stripped of his godlike aura, he becomes a mirror for modern struggles, with identity, love, and the cost of violence. Whether through queer readings of his bond with Patroclus or psychological explorations of his rage, today's storytellers ask us to see him not as a distant legend, but as someone achingly real. And as these fresh perspectives unfold, another question lingers: how much of the real Achilles might still be buried in the sands of history? That mystery leads us to our next chapter, where archaeology meets myth in the search for the man behind the legend. Turning from the pages of modern literature to the dust of ancient earth, we uncover the tangible traces that bridge myth and history. The search for Achilles extends beyond poetry into the realm of shovels and sieves, where archaeologists have spent decades sifting through the layers of time. At Hisarlik in modern Turkey, the site believed to be ancient Troy, excavations reveal a city that suffered violent destruction in the late Bronze Age, precisely when Homer's war was said to have taken place. Charred walls, arrowheads embedded in fortifications, and hastily buried human remains whisper of a catastrophic conflict that could have inspired the epic tale. But the hunt for Achilles leads us further. In Greece, the sprawling Mycenaean palaces like those of Agamemnon and Nestor hint at the powerful kingdoms capable of launching such an expedition. A grave in Thessaly, packed with weapons and gold, might belong to a warrior king whose deeds became the seed of Achilles' legend. Even the geography checks out. The narrow straits near Troy match Homer's descriptions of where Achilles chased Hector, and the coastal plains could have hosted the legendary Greek camps. The most tantalizing clues come from the so-called Heroan worship sites, where ancient Greeks venerated figures they believed were Achilles and Patroclus. On the island of Luke in the Black Sea, pilgrims left offerings for centuries at a shrine dedicated to the hero. Archaeologists found pottery shards inscribed with his name, proving that real people worshipped him as more than just a story. And in the Danube Delta, locals still point to a mound they call Achilles' grave, though no bones have been found. Yet the line between man and myth blurs. No single artifact bears Achilles' name, and the Trojan War's historicity remains debated. What we can say is this: the world Homer described was real. The armor, the ships, the social tensions all align with the late Bronze Age. Whether Achilles was one man or a composite of many great warriors, his legend grew from the soil of actual battles, where real soldiers fought and died for glory. As we brush the dirt from these fragments, another layer awaits, not in the ground, but in the lasting impact Achilles left on culture itself. His legacy, as we'll see next, stretches far beyond ancient battlefields. Now, stepping beyond the battlefield and into the echoes of time, we see how Achilles' legend has woven itself into the very fabric of culture. His story didn't end with the fall of Troy. It transformed, adapting to each new era, proving that some heroes never truly die. Take Renaissance art, where painters like Rubens and Caravaggio immortalized his rage and grief on canvas. These masterpieces didn't just depict a myth, they turned Achilles into a symbol of human passion, his flaws as vivid as his strength. Even in sculpture, from ancient Greek marbles to modern reinterpretations, his form captures the ideal of heroic beauty frozen in eternal youth, but his influence stretches far deeper than art. Language itself bears his mark. The term Achilles' heel has become shorthand for any fatal weakness, a concept so universal it's used in medicine, sports, and even cybersecurity. Psychologists reference Achilles' rage to describe destructive anger, while leadership coaches warn against the pitfalls of his pride. His name echoes in scientific discoveries too. The tendon connecting calf to heel literally bears his name, a nod to his mythic vulnerability. Literature and theater keep reinventing him. Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida painted him as a brooding mercenary, while modern novels like Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles reframe his love for Patroclus with poignant humanity. Even blockbuster films and video games borrow his traits, crafting protagonists who mirror his godlike skill and tragic hubris. Perhaps most telling is how his legacy transcends the West. From Central Asian epics that blend his story with local heroes, to Japanese manga reimagining him as a futuristic warrior, his archetype adapts endlessly. Museums worldwide display artifacts inspired by him, while athletes and soldiers still invoke his name for courage. So while archaeologists may never find his bones, Achilles lives on, not just as a character from dusty scrolls, but as a mirror humanity holds up to itself. His flaws and ferocity, his love and losses still resonate because they reflect our own struggles, and that, more than any spear or shield, is the true measure of immortality. With his tale now fully told, we're left to ponder, what does Achilles mean to you? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into mythology's greatest legends. Until next time, keep exploring the stories that shape us. As we reach the final chapter of Achilles' epic saga, let's take a moment to trace the extraordinary arc of his life, a journey that still speaks to us across 3,000 years. From his miraculous birth as the son of a goddess to his fateful death on the plains of Troy, Achilles embodies the timeless struggle between destiny and free will, between divine power and human fragility. Consider how his story holds up a mirror to our own lives. His supernatural gifts couldn't shield him from heartbreak. His unmatched strength couldn't prevent his tragic end. Even his famous invulnerability had that one vulnerable spot, a poetic reminder that perfection is an illusion. Isn't that the essence of being human? We all have our hidden weaknesses, our moments of rage and regret, our loves that define us as much as our battles. Achilles fascinates us because he's contradictory, both brutal and tender, both selfish and noble. He's the warrior who slaughters Hector in cold blood, yet weeps with Priam over their shared losses. He's the hero who chooses eternal glory over a long life, yet in his final moments, Homer shows him longing for simple human connection. These contradictions make him real, relatable, far more than just a mythical killing machine. His legacy challenges us to rethink what heroism really means. Is a hero defined by victories or by how they face their flaws, by their strength or their capacity for growth? The ancient Greeks didn't worship Achilles despite his imperfections. They revered him because of them. In a world where we're all pressured to appear flawless, perhaps there's wisdom in embracing Achilles' example. That true greatness lies in owning our humanity, heels and all. So now we turn to you. Where do you stand on history's most complex warrior? Was he a hero worth celebrating or a cautionary tale? A victim of fate or the architect of his own downfall? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which parts of his story resonated with you most. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Achilles' world, don't forget to like and subscribe for more mythology adventures. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we explore another legendary tale. Until next time, keep questioning, keep discovering, and remember, the oldest stories often have the newest lessons to teach us.